Hi everyone, welcome to our last lecture of the semester. We finally made it. And I won't be talking for all that long today. I'm just going to run through the Du Bois video or the Du Bois content that I assigned, talk a little bit about a couple of his key terms, a couple of key concepts that he devises, and then apply that to the contemporary situation or to the contemporary world a little bit. Okay, so this week, the video I had you watch was a reading of this guy, W.E.B. Du Bois, who you might have heard of before, who's a very prominent 20th century African American figure who wrote a collection of essays called The Souls of Black Folk, which is what the video was drawing from. And originally I was going to give you a reading. And in fact, I've posted the reading online. If you are interested, you should have a look at the little excerpt that I've posted. He writes very well, very poetically, very interestingly. And in The Souls of Black Folk, essentially, Du Bois is interested in, or what he's doing is, the content of The Souls of Black Folk is essentially post-Civil War reflections on the plight of African Americans, the status of African Americans in society, and so on. So, I mean, this slide is really just a bit of background about Du Bois to situate him in the historical timeline and to give you a sense of when he's writing and of how important a figure he is. So I've put that he was a sociologist, historian, poet, civil rights activist, right? I could have put a bunch more words there, but he's known primarily for those things, right? He was one of the founders of the NAACP, so the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, in 1909. He was the first African American to earn a PhD from Harvard. And the last bullet point I've put is just this, probably his most famous work, The Souls of Black Folk, that we're drawing from here, and that you might come across in other subjects depending on your interests, your degree, what you study. But he features large in sociology and other such fields as well. Okay, so from the video, the YouTube video I assigned, which if you haven't watched yet, you should watch before you're listening to this. A couple of terms come up that you'll be unfamiliar with, or a couple of terms come up that have a significance in Du Bois's work and that pick out particular features of the world and particular features of racism and the relations between African Americans and white people in the time that he's writing. And I'm just going to talk about two of those terms. So I'm just going to pick out two concepts that Du Bois comes up with that are very prominent. And the first of those is this thing that he calls the veil. So I've just put a little quote at the top from the text, which I'll just read. Then it dawned upon me with a certain suddenness that I was different from the others, or like mayhap in heart and life and longing, but shut out from their world by a vast veil. Right? So the quote is just saying, look, he's similar to white folk, to other people in most ways, in heart and life and longing, that is, but he's shut out from the world of white people by what he's calling a vast veil. So this term of his, the veil, comes up in his work a lot, and it's supposed to be a visual manifestation of racial segregation, right? So in other words, you could say it's a visual manifestation of the colour line, which is a term that you might have heard, a term that appeared and was used frequently after the abolition of slavery to refer to ongoing inequalities and divisions between black and white people. So, according to Du Bois, this veil, this metaphorical veil, right, is worn by all African Americans because their view of the world and its potential economic, political, and social opportunities are vastly different from those of white people. And the veil is supposed to be a representation of that difference, right? It's supposed to be a representation of the different worlds that people who are racialized differently in America are able to access. And that veil, like this division, this kind of segregation, is something that Du Bois a prominent activist, spent his whole life trying to remedy, right? Working to remedy. So the third bullet point I've got, according to Du Bois, the veil is a constant presence, but not necessarily one that's felt all the time, right? So the veil, the fact that there is this separation, the fact that racism exists, the fact that one's opportunities in life are affected by your skin color in a very significant way, right? That's something that's constant. That's not something that changes. But phenomenologically, right, in terms of one's own awareness of that racial segregation, of that line, that's not necessarily something that is always felt, right? So, in particular, Du Bois talks a lot about how it takes young black children a while to realize that the veil exists, right? To realize that racism exists, to realize that they are different from their white friends in a way, like that they are perceived differently, and that whether they like it or not, and indeed they presumably don't like it, as they move around the world, they will sometimes be perceived in certain ways and be reacted to in ways that white children would not be, right? So Du Bois talks a bit in The Souls of Black Folk about how he felt a perverse sense of joy that his son, who died at a very young age, died before he was old enough to perceive or to really experience the veil in any kind of significant way. Okay, the last thing I've put on this slide is just that Du Bois characterizes this veil both as a blessing and as a curse, right? So I'll take the curse part first. The curse part seems the easiest, right? Clearly the veil is bad, like it's bad, it's an exclusionary veil, right? Him talking about how he comes to realize that he's shut out from the world of white people by a vast veil, right? That is a curse. That's an exclusion. He would like to be able to move around the world in the same way that white people do, but he was unable to because all the time, all these little things, and sometimes big things, happen to remind him that he's not, in fact, part of that world, not able to move in that world in the same way. The fact that he also characterizes the veil as a blessing, that's a little more confusing perhaps, but he characterizes it as a blessing essentially because he wants to say that in some ways being excluded from the world of white people has lent African Americans certain advantages or leads to them being able to see the world more clearly in some ways. To really explain what I mean by that, I'm just going to move on to the second term that I wanted to talk about that Du Bois devised. Okay. So the second thing then that I wanted to talk about is this notion that Du Bois gives us of double consciousness. And again, this particularly, like this more so than the veil, this is a very famous concept, very influential. Scholars and beyond scholars, this is still talked about a lot today, essentially, is what I'm saying here. Okay, so the quote I've put is just, "It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity." So, double consciousness then, I've put a more general description first. So the first bullet point I've just put, it's the internal conflict experienced by subordinated groups in an oppressive society. So to put that in my own words, or to put that more colloquially, it refers to the idea that when you're a non-dominant group in a society, so for Du Bois in particular, he's talking about being African American in the United States, right? Important that like he's not talking about the plight of or the status of black people across the world. He's talking historically situated within America, right? So what he's talking about when he talks about double consciousness is this thing that I've got in the second bullet point. So this idea that African Americans inevitably experience, in a sense, two fields of vision, right? So African Americans experience the world, just the way that they view it, the way that they view themselves moving through the world, but also, inevitably, all the time, African Americans are also viewing themselves through the eyes of white people around them, right? They have to, and they end up thinking about how the world is perceiving them. So for Du Bois, how white people are seeing them. So it's this sense of always looking at yourself and having to measure yourself through the eyes of others. So the point is that, as with the veil, this is both a terrible thing and also, for Du Bois, in some senses, an advantage, right? So it's a bad thing for obvious reasons, right? Because it's extra burdensome, right? Black people have to spend a bunch of time thinking about how they're perceived by white people. White people don't have to spend that much time thinking about how they're perceived by black people, right? In general, like, it's not as important. But for an African American moving around the world, sometimes you can't help but be aware of how white people are perceiving you. That little old white lady perceives you as a threat, right? That you're being judged more harshly, or that you're being stereotyped in certain ways, right? Black people have to be aware of these things in society, sometimes as a matter of survival, sometimes just as a matter of you can't ignore that people are staring at you a bit, that people are being racist, and so on. The point is that black people have to do this in a way that white people aren't forced to, right? Like, white people don't have to have the same considerations, don't have to have this same measuring themselves by their own standards and inevitably by the standards of another, more dominant group, right? But in terms of Du Bois characterizing double consciousness as an advantage, he thinks it's an advantage in an epistemological sense, right? So remembering that epistemology here is just talking about knowledge, right? So he just wants to say something like, look, African Americans, to the extent that they are measuring themselves through the eyes of white people and just experiencing the world themselves, like, we just know more stuff, right? He's saying there's an advantage to being able to see the world the way it is, right? We know more about society, we know more about how stuff works. We're more in touch with reality in a sense, right? He's saying something like that. Okay. So hopefully my explanations of those two concepts have been clear. I'm just going to briefly talk about a more contemporary concept that I think is linked to the idea of double consciousness, and then we're wrapping up for this lecture. Okay, so I just wanted to introduce the notion of code switching because this is, I think, hopefully it's already obvious how double consciousness applies in the contemporary world. Hopefully the video will have helped to illuminate that too. But I think it's worthwhile here to also loop in another concept to really bring this into the present day. Okay, so code switching, the definition I've got here of code switching is just the second bullet point I've got, so I've just put code switching occurs when somebody in a conversational context, right, changes their language, so the language they're using, the accent they're using, or their manner of speech, so just how they're comporting themselves, based on who they're with, right, based on their audience. Typically, that change is made in order to better fit in with that group, right? And then I've just put a few examples of why we might code switch. And I've put, we might code switch to fit in, we might code switch to express solidarity or identity, or we might code switch to exclude others. So code switching, billions of examples I could give here, but just something could be something like, in an everyday case, it's something like you go to a job interview, or you're talking to a friend and then you notice someone walk out of a building who's your boss or something like that, and then suddenly you start speaking more formally, right? You stop using slang, right? You start speaking in such a way that you want to be perceived as professional, right? In terms of accent, people code switch all the time between, by which I mean just change the kind of language they use. Sometimes the accent they use when they're talking with family, right? Often people's accents become stronger when they're talking to family or to very old friends, right? And especially with old friends or family, you might also have certain modes of communication with them where you have certain like slang terms that nobody else will understand because it's kind of an old in joke, something like that, right? You all change your manner of speech to some extent, I think, when you talk to me, because I'm your professor, and there's a certain kind of mode of communication that we have between ourselves. But if I then left the room and you're then talking to a friend, the way that you're talking to that friend just is different, right? So the reason I'm saying that this is a related concept then clearly is that code switching is something that might happen because somebody of a minority group is trying to fit in with a majority group, right? So code switching, not always a bad thing, clearly. Sometimes it's good. It's good that we have different modes of communication for different aspects of our lives, but code switching might be a bad thing, right? When one has to code switch in order to be accepted, right? So code switching is bad if the mode of code switching is, so say you're an immigrant to the United States and you have a strong accent, and at times you feel like you really have to conceal that accent in order to be taken seriously or in order for people to listen to you, right? That's a form of code switching that we can see as potentially harmful or potentially as bad. And the reason I think this links to double consciousness, right, is it links to this feeling of being aware of how others perceive you, right? So code switching has been talked about with regard to African Americans and African Americans having a different mode of speech sometimes between themselves, so between other African Americans and in white spaces, right? So if any of you saw the movie Sorry to Bother You, this kind of idea comes up there. And actually, I think I'm going to assign just a short Key and Peele skit that also demonstrates this kind of mode of code switching. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Hopefully, all of that content has been clear. I will also post now the last reading response for you to do. And that is us done for the semester, other than the final exam, which I will give you more information about very soon. Thank you all so much for sticking with me. I know that the move online has been challenging, more challenging for some. In general, I know that everything is challenging right now. Everything is different and changing and new. But really, congratulations on hanging in there, getting to the end of semester. Congrats on coping with the move online, on sticking with it, staying in communication, all of that stuff. You've been a really lovely class. I am sad that we didn't get to meet again after March. I'm sad that we didn't get to do in-person discussions and that all of that was curtailed, but thank you so much for sticking with it. And I hope that you all stay well in the upcoming weeks and months. And yeah, all the very best.